Good morning, Jan Recker.
Hey Nick, how you doing?
Good. I'm very excited. We have Elmira Broek and Marleen Huysman joining us today and we're going to talk about their paper that we've accepted to the special issue at MIS Quarterly, and they're going to give us the backstory. So welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Yes, we're very excited both. Thanks for inviting us.
So your paper is on one of the key issues on machine learning, I think, that's in the popular media. And it's this idea of people analytics and I've seen this out in the world where people will come, they're like snake oil salesmen, where they come out and tell you, hey, we'll give you an algorithm using artificial intelligence, and this will enable you to hire people that are wonderful. And they train it based on your successful people. Then they give it to your applicants. And then the idea is that your applicants will look like your successful people, right? So it works perfectly. There's no nonsense about this whatsoever. And it's a wonderful approach to weeding people out when you hire them, right? Would you agree with that? Or are there issues with this, Elmira?
Well, yes, Nick, you summarized it nicely. I think that's mainly the big promise that we currently see around people analytics, but also a lot of other, I think, AI applications for really social areas such as hiring. So I think, Marleen and I both attended also a lot of these meetups currently going on around AI and hiring, and they all start with these very kind of emotional stories, as in I have experienced like discrimination myself. This is a bad thing. Like no one should be unfairly judged. And often this happens because we have all these biases as human beings that we're often not even aware of. So AI is indeed this big thing that can help us to overcome that. Yeah. And actually with our study, we show, well, it's a bit more complex than that. And it goes actually in quite a difficult or different direction. Although developers do start with that belief and are actually quite these type of moralists that we saw, which also makes it interesting. Like they're not bad people, like they actually have quite a very nice vision, very idealistic. But when entering real world organizations, like a lot of complexity is added.
Yeah, they're moralists. They do it. So the famous one is the Amazon study, right? Where they wanted to eliminate gender discrimination. And what they did was actually amplify gender discrimination, the naive way they implemented their machine learning models, right? But tell us about the ethnography. Like, how did you come up with this machine learning company? How did you stumble into them? How did the process unfold with this paper?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So actually, it's always kind of a challenge, of course, to get access to such companies. And I think, especially with AI, like one of the first things is, are they actually doing AI, or what type of AI are they doing? Of course, there is a very broad range of all types of things that might fall under that category. And then it's the case, are they actually using it? So that's another criteria that was very important to us for selecting such organizations. And then we actually, I think, Marleen, you can tell a bit about that because you were the first contact person. We got in touch with this AI vendor. There was
this, actually we came in contact with the intermediary of this AI vendor, a person who worked in the Netherlands for this AI vendor. The AI vendor is based in the UK. And so of course we said, this is a wonderful tool that you're making. And we think that this is great what you're doing. And I think for us, for researchers, it's so important to understand how you're developing this tool. And we are with you that this will change the AR community and the AI profession completely. And so this is actually what we always do when we start with our ethnographies. It's a bit, on the edge, because we are always telling them that they are doing great stuff and that we are fascinated with what they're doing, and that we really would like to have the insights of everything.
This is really interesting what you're saying, because I had both points on my sheet of paper here, but I look at them very differently. So what just Nick said is so exciting about the paper. I actually don't find all that exciting at all. So what I find exciting about your paper is that you studied over time how people develop AI. Yes, it's AI for HR, and that's an exciting, complex thing in itself. But what I find really interesting is that you through your ethnography, you study how they develop it, you know, because I always think like, oh, people look at AI and it's like a box and they put it and then apply it somewhere. But no, the box is coming from someone has built the box, you know, and no one is unpacking how that unfolds. And that's what I find exciting, right? Maybe it's because of my background, because I'm interested in systems development and questions like this. But isn't it funny that we both look at this, the same paper, and Nick finds it interesting that it's AI for hiring and all the fairness and bias and ethical issues. And I look at it and just being excited what it tells us about how are the AI systems being developed.
Yeah, but are we really talking about how they're being developed? The way I look at this case is this is one instance. You guys tell me about this, because I think Recker is wrong. This is not a case study about how AI is developed. This is a case study about how AI is developed in one particular organization, and it's probably not, I guess, representative of the way AI is developed.
Yeah, interesting argument there. I guess, well, I think what is nice, of course, we are focusing on one case. Marleen is working on a lot of different cases as well. So we have people looking at radiology, at the police, agriculture, all these different things. But of course, we are now looking at the case of hiring and HR. But I think what is interesting here is that what we saw, especially when taking such an ethnographic approach, and I think what Jan is saying, that we are able to trace such an organization for 2 years, and we're still collecting some data there. So I mean, it's great to at least be so close and be able to trace that over time. And there we do see some things that also caught our attention that are repeating. So for example, indeed, this belief about, well, we have to move away from this expert, you know, indeed this bias aspect, but also the strong belief in data being able to tell us which direction to go, which judgments to make, which insights to follow. And then over and over again, different instances of actually being pushed back and realizing, well, we really cannot do this alone. Like we saw these instances happening around indeed the data itself, building the model, working with the actual predictions and using it to hire or select someone. So I think at least for us as researchers, that really helped to show different examples or illustrations of this kind of pattern happening throughout our case, moving away and actually collaborating and moving towards the expert again, which we think applies, or we hope at least, and of course it has to be tested further, but to similar cases of AI in these type of social domains, at least the ones that work with experts and domain experts.
Thank you, Elmira. You perfectly demonstrated how it's not me that is wrong, but Nick. I mean, like, this is interesting, right? This is fascinating. It sort of challenges these sort of assumptions that, oh, you build AI, all we need is data. We throw it in there and outcome whatever you're looking for. Yeah, we need to tune it. But, you know, as you said in the beginning, it's way more complicated than this. And
well, it can really be way more complicated.
Yeah, it can be. And that also means that in itself, just showing that is interesting. And this question of generalizability, what you just mentioned, I couldn't care less. Why does it have to be representative?
Yeah, you actually can care less, because you're overturning assumptions, right? So you create the initial picture and it could be a caricature or it could be real. And I would argue that it's real. We have outcome variables that are well-defined, and then we train our models on and what this case shows is, well, those outcome variables, people don't agree on them. Right. That's one of the issues. Then the other issue is, well, people don't want to create the training data set. Right. So you problematized a lot of the naive assumptions. Now, we don't know to what degree that problematization happens at every other organization. We don't. And we don't need to. I agree with you, Jan, that a rich description in itself is the beauty of ethnography. But we also can't just put out the rich description. We have to have a setup for it. And I think the setup for this one is, this is the promise. This is what we saw, and it doesn't fit the promise, right?
So can I, Marleen and Elmira, can I turn this a little bit? Because you said something really interesting earlier about the origin. And you know, Marleen, you talked about that you were working with this vendor, you sort of got introduced to them and you were working with them.
She buttered them up. She praised them a lot and told them how wonderful they were. Yeah.
In some of the earlier episodes, we talked a lot about approaches such as problem-driven research, phenomenon-driven research. And I wonder what you describe here fits any of these categories, or whether it's just really opportunity-driven research in the sense of you got to meet this vendor and you got along with them and you buttered them up and they invited you to come along and, you know, sort of follow them on their journey. And this is really where that study came from. Or did you have a hypothesis in mind and set out to test it? Or were you interested in a particular problem, right? So my guess is, was it really opportunity driven? How did you get to the study?
Yeah, it's probably both, although it wasn't hypothesis testing, but it was opportunity driven, but also we were very interested in this phenomena of AI development. So everyone's talking about AI changing work practices, and no one actually in our field is studying how these systems are developed. Yeah. And so that is our belief, that you cannot say much about these systems, how they change work, if you do not know how they are developed, because, you know, much of it is already inscribed in the development process. And understanding how these people develop these systems and how they understand the domain experts, which is, you know, very difficult if you're a data scientist and you work, you know, in this case, from Belgium versus, or from Europe versus the UK. There's a large gap. So we came into that with this problem of how to cope with the gap between the developers and the domain experts. And of course, this opportunity came along with this vendor that was, very, very, very nice people. So they're very open for research. The chief researcher at this company, a very open and interesting person.
Did you have to promise them something in return, like a report to them or something, or?
No, not really. He had a PhD. He has a PhD as well, and in this, so that makes a big difference.
That makes a big difference, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I always say that we never write reports, because, you know, these will end up in drawers anyway. So, but we will present our work, and we write papers, and also practitioner-oriented papers, and they can have their name on it if they want to. And
you didn't use their name. Did they see the paper before you published it, or no?
Well, so what we did, we are, what our approach is, and also with the client, is showing pieces of actually the findings, so in presentation. So especially with the clients where we did longer study, even there would be bi-monthly like presentations, taking them along, and some of the more descriptive data that we are having or insights. And at the end, of course, well, the whole theoretical and conceptual framing there comes later. So that isn't something where they are involved in that stage. But of course, kind of validating or discussing some of those insights, discussing whether it makes sense or what parts are difficult. And sometimes that can also be a bit challenging, because not everything that you are presenting is, of course, fun or positive, or can also be a bit critical in that sense. So but in this case, we didn't do,
What impacted them? Like, were there any surprises or anything that, that came out of this, some insight that they weren't anticipating in those conversations?
Well, I think what we saw was that actually from the developer side, they had no idea actually really on how the client was working with the system, what difficulties were arising around managers using the prediction. So for them, there was a big black box, and also a surprise. So I think, I'm not sure if it ended up in the final version, but we have this quote on Indeed, this surprise of not getting enough participants or people for actually generating the training data set. And that was so weird, because that was most easy from indeed this theoretical point of view. Like, why aren't people willing to generate data about themselves?
That made it in the paper, actually. And I know your paper better than you do. Are you sure you wrote this?
Well, I remember at least the quote was we had some discussions about it, but those maybe things, I think there we at least were able to generate or give some new insights there. And I think really about the underlying aspects there, how people are using it, which sometimes came as a surprise. Yeah. And that's mainly because at the start, at least, there were very separate worlds. And perhaps also because, of course, it's a vendor too, but often we see these groups working in quite, funnels or separate worlds.
That's, by the way, also a way to get access. Is by saying that we can offer a holistic view. Yeah. But doing ethnographies, you're including all stakeholders, and that's wonderful, because you usually do not see what's happening in the other side. But also, when you were saying that, Elmira, I was thinking, weren't we the boundary spanners here? And if we were not there, would the same have happened?
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's interesting, huh?
Now, did they ever kick you out as an ethnographer and say you can't look at this, or you can't come here, or you can't go to this meeting? Did they do any of that?
Well, I think you of course try to build trust over time, but what is tricky, because we are studying two different organizations actually here, so the vendor and the client. So I had a time that I spent a lot of time with the client, and then you go back to the vendor and they are a bit suspicious. Like, they were even surprised, actually. I didn't start working at the company after finalizing the data collection. So they said, well, you are a true researcher, like you didn't move to the company. So yeah, somewhere there's always this idea, perhaps, well, she really likes the team there, and like, we should be careful with what we are saying, but and that might result in them being more careful or sensitive in what they're saying. But I think, we were also lucky with both organizations. And as an ethnographer, you do have the time to really get to know the people, and also informally, and go to bars together. So you also have this very different relationship you're building. That is the secret. No,
that's Jan. That's Recker's secret too. He goes to bars with everybody. That's how he makes friends.
I have done that occasionally. I wanted to talk about ethnographies because I have several reasons. So number one, I find it just so insightful that we're talking about such a technology-focused theme, AI. And we're using one of these very old school traditional field methods, observational field methods, right? And I don't think that a lot of people that look at AI think of ethnography as their first method of choice, right? But I also know that in your group at VU, you're doing a lot of these ethnographies. So can you talk a little bit about this? So I find this contrast really interesting, right? So you have a very traditional old school field methods at this smaller scale, very resource intensive, and you're studying something that is actually meant to be computational, large data, big scale, right? So it's it's interesting contrast, I think.
Yeah, I also think it's very interesting and and also quite novel. Well, I think it shouldn't be novel because it makes so much sense to study it from an ethnography perspective, ethnography methods. But there are several reasons for doing it. I think that studying AI from the start till its use cannot be studied from with a different methodology, actually. As for one reason, as I said, that there are so many stakeholders involved. So you cannot just look at it from only the domain experts, how they are using the AI, or you cannot only study it from the developers. Managers are also very important. Why do they want to embark on AI? So all these stakeholders need to be involved. And what is also important is that with AI, you most often talk with people who have a different worldview, so different epistemologies, and to really get to understand their way of looking at the world and from different perspectives, you need to have this practice perspective. So really go into, create deep knowledge about it. And then also ethnographies help to have a process analysis. So we're studying the changes, so the introduction of AI, the development of AI, and that takes years. It doesn't happen in one.
See, and I think that's the key point. I mean, I agree with you on all these counts, but you also gotta say, well, that makes it an absolute niche. Forget about AI, but in AI research in general, there's very few ethnographies, there's very few practice studies, there's even fewer ethnographic process practice studies, right?
Yeah.
And even though you say, look, it makes a lot of sense from a variety of angles to do this, why do you think why is it such a niche? I mean, there's
I can tell you, it all has to do with publications. And also, funding. So follow the money, I would say, because, Elmira spent almost all her PhD time on only this case, and all my PhDs are only focusing on one case. Yeah. So that is a lot of money focused on only one paper. And then also this, you were so nice to accept our paper, but not all journals like ethnographies because they don't have space for it.
Well, you mentioned space. That's the thing that drives me nuts. We allow the same space for an ethnography that we allow for, say, an econometric paper. Right. And in my reading anyway, an econometric paper can be concise. Mm-hmm. and be great. And ethnography, concise, essentially eviscerates the ethnography, right? The beauty of the ethnography, the appropriate medium for an ethnography is a book.
Yeah.
I want to see the rich story. Each chapter, each section of yours, the stages should be a chapter in a book. Yeah. The front end, and the problem is we don't value books. We only value research papers.
Yeah.
And
big trouble.
And we're going to have this research paper and we're going to force you into 40 pages. So we end up taking this really rich data set that you have and turning it into sound bites.
Yeah. Elmira, you can say something about it, because that was very painful. We had to kill a lot of darlings because of you guys.
Yeah.
It was Wrecker. I wanted more in the paper.
Oh, okay.
Cutting.
No, there are different storylines. And I think, well, for me, as I think a junior or starting scholar, was also very insightful to actually move from that complexity and all these different aspects and themes you might be able to highlight to just kind of a simple story in a way, or at least it feels like a very abstracted version of what you initially could tell or wanted to tell. But I also saw some benefits from it, or at least it also makes it stronger to, of course, have one very clear focus. So in the end, I also liked narrowing it down and focusing on this central tension that we also focus on in the paper. But let's see how the further journey goes, and if we have time to also explore those other things, because you all get attached or feel attached to those and want to tell those stories as well. So just curious how that will proceed. But
so Elmira, I want to actually use this opportunity to drill you a little bit more on this, because Nick and I, we've talked to one extent. We made a lot of assumptions about what junior researchers are doing, should be doing, and so forth. And we also made a lot of sort of assertions about, I don't know, how the review process should unfold and how this all works. And no, you have a great opportunity to actually reflect a little bit on this, on that really works. Can we ask you a little bit of, how was that process for you? I mean,
in other words, criticize Wrecker for the horrible job he did in handling this paper. And now's your time, because it's already accepted.
Yeah, but I'm serious here, right? So because you have a rich ethnography, and the review process essentially consisted of narrowing it down to one story, and dropping a lot of other stuff, and actually, moving you from one idea a little bit to a somewhat different idea. I remember the very first version of that paper was quite different. So I only have my perspective on this, but how was it for you? Like you got the review packages in your email. Talk us through this a little bit, if you may.
Sure. Yeah. So to be honest, I actually found it very informative, where I learned like a lot, like crazy.
And that's why I asked you. I really want to heap more praise on us.
Can you praise? Yes. Did you know what I wrote in there? Can you praise that portion a little bit?
No, I think in a way, well, at least like you hear all these kind of horror stories on very like extreme negative or critical editors and reviewers. And I think in a way, the direction we moved towards felt very much in line with what we like. So indeed, this first framing was really into information system development literature, which wasn't a fit at all. So I think that was great that we moved away from that, more into the area of knowledge, which we ended up with, more narrowing it down to knowledge work and also this practice perspective. So in that sense, that was a nice journey, which I felt added a lot to telling the story or highlighting.
Touch on this really quick. You thought that the ISD kind of approach would be more palatable to a review process. And you're saying that the review process brought you back to where you actually wanted to be, right? And I think that's interesting, because I always do this too. I write a paper for how I think the reviewers will take it rather than what I really want to say sometimes.
That's a horrible thing to say.
That sounds very strategic.
I'm just saying, you have this intuition where you're writing it for them, rather than, or at least, I guess I don't necessarily do this, but there's an impulse to do that, right?
No, I don't think there is. Marleen, please.
Marleen?
Yeah, well, I remember the first time I presented this paper was in Sweden with Johnny Holmström.
Holmström, yeah.
And Jan was there.
I was there,
and, I knew Jan was there beforehand, and I knew that Jan was doing this special issue on MSQ with a deadline in a year or so. So this was all strategic.
In a year and a month, I think.
Oh, was a month?
Or like 2 months. No, it was
right.
very soon.
You're right. We said, shall we go for MSQ? And then, can we do that? That's in 2 months' time. And let's just try it. And let's present this for Jan. So there was another audience as well. There was an audience, but for me, it's only Jan mattered.
Wow. I don't think we could ever publish this particular podcast here. I'm also quite mindful of the time. I wanted to ask one more thing, but what I was quite conscious, because it wasn't planned like this, but we had the plan of having a fairly condensed timeframe for the special issue, right? We really pushed everyone. The call for paper was due in 2 months. We had a very quick rounds of reviews, and we had very quick rounds for the authors as well, right? And then it so happened that all of that was during the pandemic. We didn't foresee this, of course, but, at times in between, it's like, oh, Jesus Christ, people must hate us because we're pushing everyone. We pushed ourselves as well, but we pushed reviewers, we pushed the AEs, we pushed the authors through several rounds in just a little bit over 1.5 years while everyone was struggling with the very personal impact that the pandemic created for them. So, was it tough? Was it easy? Was it a good thing to do? Was it not a good thing? How was it for you? How was the experience?
We were, as Elmira said, we were very happy with you guys, really, seriously. And also that it was so fast, because then, we had the pace and the momentum, and we could just continue with that, and we couldn't lose the pace. It was one of the best review process, to be honest.
To be honest, I had a similar experience once as an author with entrepreneurship theory in practice, a special issue where they pushed everyone in a year, and I liked it. Because you never had to get back into your paper because you didn't have a 4-month break in between. You were it was still sharp. It was still in everyone's mind, and you could just continue to push through. Right? Yeah. I kind of like that too. Says a lot about our review practices, yes. I suppose. Right?
Yes, it was very interesting. Yeah. So, so I was telling the story about that I was presented for Jan. I was making it too black and white, of course, but I knew that. So ISD is something that you like, Jan. Yeah. And so and we didn't know. Is it the
and he's
ISD
a German.
story?
Germans like that kind of thing.
Yeah, I know. Is it a German story or is it a Dutch story?
But see, I'm an American. I actually don't know the difference between a German and a Dutch, right?
Yeah, we're not going into that.
We're not going into this. We should also probably clarify, like, we happened to be at the same workshop. I'm not sure how strategic it was. It was the first time that I heard about it. And I remember talking to you after the seminar saying, like, I think there's an angle here to ISD, because I found it fascinating too, that you studied how these AI systems were developed. And I remember encouraging you to go ahead and submit because I thought it was a good fit. And then, of course, after the first review round, we learned, well, ISD, that's not the story. So we should also be very explicit on this. But yeah, I think, look, guys, I think this was really, really good. I mean, I think this gives a lot of more context to a paper, a great paper that we normally get. I'm pretty sure, I really hope that people that listen to this will read the paper, in the same sense that people that read the paper hopefully maybe also want to hear some of the backstory here, right? So congratulations again, and thanks for being on the show, I suppose.
Yeah, great work. Thank you.
Nice to be there.
Thanks.